can I ask a question, please?
Sure, please do.
Um, this is kind of not related, but I just wanted to know, just curious. We live like in the period of uncertainty with this coronavirus thing, and so the question is, if I were a policymaker, what model should I use? Because you said we couldn't use like the workforce models. Should I go with my gut, or should I still like use a model
Okay.
based on
Yeah.
workforce?
Okay. Okay. Well, you jump into something a bit different here, but I'm glad you raised that question. I was saying earlier, forget about this current crisis. Even the 2008 crisis, you know the story in 2008 is basically economic crisis, whereas now is health crisis. Okay, now what we are experiencing is the public health crisis, the virus. Of course, that public health crisis have ramification on many other sectors, including economic sector. But the trigger, the current crisis, the trigger is not economy, unlike in 2008. So you can imagine, even the event triggered by economic phenomena, like in 2008, macroeconomic Wirtschaftswirtschaft model failed to explain that. By the way, the failure is not only failure in terms of not able to predict that crisis, but also it fails in terms of estimating what is the consequence of that crisis. So after the crisis happened, what is the consequence of that crisis? Macroeconomic workhorse model failed to explain that, let alone predicting the crisis. But even after you present the fact that there is a crisis as the macroeconomics workhorse modelers, they will not be able to explain what's the consequence. Now imagine if that is the case, will you listen to macroeconomists for policy response? If the model failed to predict and failed to estimate the consequence of the crisis, how would you listen to these people in terms of what should we do if there's a crisis? So how can you rely on them for guidance? You cannot, right? Now imagine, here we are still talking about economic driven crisis like in 2008. And now your question is, now this crisis was not driven by economics. This crisis was driven by public health. What do macroeconomists understand and know about it? Zero, nothing, zip. So it's even impossible to use the standard workhorse macroeconomic models to estimate that. What macroeconomists are still doing, okay, is not so much about understanding the crisis, the public health crisis, but they are trying to do something with the economic impact of this current crisis. So it's not so much about the, well, actually, I'm planning to discuss about it towards the end, but since you already raised this, why don't we continue the discussions about this? Let's think in a simple way. Let's not think in a complicated way. The crisis started with the victims, right? People got sick and some of them even died, okay? And because of that, what is affected? What is affected is the confidence of the people, right? And the fear of the people. What are they fearing of? They're fearing of getting infected, or they're even fear to die, right? Because expert in public health cannot give us a convincing answer. What kind of virus is this, and what is the best medicine for that? Nobody can tell, right? When you are in that situation, when you don't know what is really the impact of this virus, what happened with your mind? You become very jittery. And if you become jittery, then you're afraid. You're afraid to do almost anything, right? Now, let's now put the position in a policymakers. When you're the policymakers and you see that population is in that situation, what do you do? Suppose the population becomes jitter. and populations become afraid of being infected. And what do you do as a policymakers? Now, remember, this question, it's not economic question. This is outside economics, right? Because we are talking about how to avoid being infected and so forth. Now, let me ask you, how many of you in the class? 22 students, right? Let me hear from some of you. If this simple story that I was telling you presented to you, and if you are the policymakers, remember, we are not talking about economic here. If you are present policymakers, what would you do? Remember, your challenge is how to reduce the fear, right? And how to reduce the possibility of being infected. What do you do? Let me hear.
I think we're going to do the massive rapid testing to a lot of
Testing, correct?
yeah.
Testing, right? Now let's develop the scenario. We test. Let's be optimistic here. Suppose we test 75%, not necessarily 100%. Let's say we test 75% of the population, okay? And let's say out of that 75%, 30% are infected. Suppose, okay? So that means the 70% is not infected. Okay, so that is Christian, right, who answered correctly. Now let me ask, but I hope other than Christian can answer. So suppose you know that after you do the massive testing, 70% is not infected, 30% infected. What do you do the next?
Um, we're going to isolate those who are infected so that we will
Correct.
prevent them from spreading.
Aha. But this is still Christian, right, answering.
Right.
Okay, that's okay. That's okay. So you're right, Christian. So if you know 30%, why don't you isolate the 30%? What happens if you do that? Well, the 70% feel more confident. Okay, then I can go out, I can continue working and so forth, correct? But remember, used to be 100%, but now only 70%. Now, slowly, I'm asking you the economic question. Imagine there are two scenarios, scenario A, which is normal, no crisis, and scenario B, which is crisis. In scenario A, 100% of workers work, but in scenario B, only 70%. Let me ask you, which one will create better economic outcome?
The first
Scenario A.
scenario.
The first one, right? The first one.